Now, we might think, when I mention Oprah, and I also think of other leaders, thought leaders, Deepak Chopra, Tony Robbins, Jack Canfield, in the personal development realm, and then just in so many other realms, there's these leaders who have the years of experience behind them. But we might think about the youth. What about the future? Who's coming up next? Well, our first speaker is going to be a good example that we're on the right track. Gabrielle Scrimshaw, at a very young age, knew that there was something bigger than her city, her town rather, her province, her country, and she went to see the world. And through her own experiences, she inspired other people. She's become a leader in the Aboriginal community, and even bigger in the professional and in the business and the educational realm. She has started a nonprofit for Aboriginal youth. She has been named the inaugural First Nations Youth Achiever by Inspire. She was one of the 4 people chosen to go to the Asian Professional Economic Cooperation, the CEO Summits in Japan, as one of the Voices of the Future delegates. As a leader, I believe that it's someone who provides focus and perspectives, and that's what Gabrielle does. She brings people together and doesn't look at misunderstandings or issues that stand in the way that people would think of as problems, but rather focuses on opportunities. She brings people together in that way, and right now, she's going to share her story and what she knows. Ladies and gentlemen, Gabrielle Scrimshaw.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. So as Zane mentioned, I'm of proud Dene heritage. And as Aboriginal people, whenever we gather in a space like this, it's a really intimate space. It's an opportunity for us to learn from one another and share these stories and pieces from our own personal journeys. And when we do that, we always recognize the traditional territory that we're gathered on, that we're safely gathered on. And before I start today, I want to recognize the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people. So thank them for allowing us to be on their traditional territory this morning. Now, people often ask me how I got to be where I am today. And it's not because, where I am is somehow marvelously exceptional. Instead, it usually comes from a place of knowing where I started. And that because I'm an Aboriginal woman who was born in northern Canada to a single-parent household, that quite frankly, statistically speaking, I'm not supposed to be standing in front of you here today. So I want to share with you parts of my journey that will sort of take you on where did I start and where did I end up. And I believe it was Kofi Annan who said, to live is to choose, but to choose well, you have to know who you are and what you stand for, where you're going and why you want to get there. So I want to share with you a little about who I am, what I stand for, where I'm going, and why I've dedicated my life to getting there, and why I believe we should all sort of look to that as a way for us as Canadians to go. I want to share with you how, through my own choices, but perhaps more importantly, the choices of others and those around me, I'm able to be standing in front of you here today. And because an elder once told me that the strength of who we are as Indigenous people comes from the fact that we speak from the heart, and that for thousands of years we've passed down our traditional knowledge, history, and culture through story, I want to share with you some very personal stories that are near and dear to my heart. So from the beginning, this is my backyard where I grew up. Growing up, I didn't actually realize that being an Indigenous person was a difficult experience. In fact, many of my childhood memories, my very fond childhood memories, were of days spent on the lake fishing with my dad, in the bush learning about wildlife, eating smoked moose meat, and even one summer every year I got to fall asleep listening to that sacred beat of the powwow drum. Now, the flip side of this, however, is that as the youngest of 3 daughters in a single-parent household, we did face many hardships as a family. Times in my life like at the age of 7, the first time I realized that I didn't grow up with a mother, nor would I have one, because we had to deal with substance abuse issues in our family. Or at the age of 12, when, because of some family issues, I was essentially left physically and emotionally alone. This was the start of a very dark chapter in my life, and I can vividly remember being 14 years old, sitting on the edge of my bed, seriously contemplating that the world would probably be a better place without me, and that nobody would miss me if I was gone. And as the youngest of 3 daughters in a single-parent household, we did face many hardships as a family, hardships that I didn't realize that most Canadians didn't face on a consistent basis. This is just what I knew, what was around me. But then 3 moments, I want to share with you 3 moments that happened in my life. Moments that helped shape who I am as a person, where I'm going, and illustrate sort of the choices that I've been able to make myself. Now, the first moment was a moment by chance and completely out of my control. It was my first course correction. Now, I was 15. I was still in this really dark space in my life. And a friend of a teacher decided to swing by and teach my class about some of the development work that he'd done in other countries. So after his presentation, he'd shared about all the work that he'd done in all these different countries. This really sparked my interest because I'm like, wow, look at all these places this guy has gone. I just want to learn a little bit about them. And so he decided to give me, a few minutes of his time. But this few minutes turned into over an hour where, through this really deep heart-to-heart moment, I told him about some of the challenges I was going through, some of the thoughts that I had in my head, the challenges that my family was going through, that my community was going through, but also I shared with him my dreams, the things that I wanted to do, the countries I wanted to see, the experiences I wanted to have that I read about in books and seen on TV. And he became the first person in my life that I ever remember telling me that he believed in me and that I was an amazing young woman. And something so simple came at a time in my life when I really needed to hear those words. And this planted this small seed inside of me, this small seed that eventually grew into this unrelenting, almost desperate hope that there had to be more to my existence. And there had to be more to the world than what I saw within the walls of my small northern community. Now, the second moment that happened in my life didn't really happen to me at all. It actually happened to my sister. But it happened on March 21st, 2006. And in some respects, I actually consider that the day my life really started, because that was the day that my nephew Ethan was born. And when I think about that day, what I remember so vividly was sitting there in the hospital holding Ethan for the very first time and just being so overwhelmed with this kind of love like I had never felt before. It's the kind of love where I knew I would do anything to make his life better. But in that moment, I also realized, sadly, that although Ethan was born only hours before, that because of who he was, being an Indigenous person, that he would have to grow up facing some very daunting circumstances, not unlike the ones I'd had to face growing up. And I just remember feeling this overwhelming sense of injustice, that before he'd even had the opportunity to make his first choice in life, that so much of his life was already made up for him. Now, the third moment happened to me after I'd finished high school. That small seed that gentleman had planted inside of me allowed me to work through a lot of insecurity, ended up leaving my small community, becoming the first person in my family, my extended family, to go and get a post-secondary education. So in between the first and second years of university, I moved to this new city to start this internship. And so late one evening, there's about 10 of us at a friend's house. We're all sitting around chatting. And this one gentleman, this young guy, he was telling us how his dad was an RCMP officer, his brother was an RCMP officer, and his uncle was an RCMP officer. And wouldn't you know it, he was telling us how excited he was to be an RCMP officer. And the words that he said next are words that will stick with me for the rest of my life. He said, "I can't wait to become a police officer so I can shoot some effing Indians." And of a group of about 10 of us, some people knew that I was First Nations and nobody said anything. But perhaps more unjustly, I didn't say anything. I just remember feeling this overwhelming sense of shame that I was who I was, that I was one of these people he felt should be shot, and I didn't want to admit to it. So the moment passed, a day passed, a week passed, pretty soon about a month had passed, and I carried around this weight with me. So eventually I told my sister, my oldest sister Jessica, what had happened. And my sister, who's so calm, cool, and collected, she got mad at me. She started yelling at me. She said, "Gabrielle, why didn't you say anything?" And when I couldn't come up with a good enough answer, she said, "Gabrielle, what if that guy does go and become an RCMP officer? And what if that native that he grows up to one day shoot is Ethan?" I remember the breath coming out of my lungs, just sitting there so still. Because out of every way that I had thought about it, mostly thinking about myself, that was not something that had crossed my mind. That's something I could have said and done could have changed his life. But this made me realize that it wasn't just about me anymore. That I had this choice to make, that I could either continue living on my life, sort of thinking about my own wants and needs, or I had the opportunity through the things I say, through the things I do, but just as importantly, through things I don't say, to make a difference in Ethan's life, but also the hundreds and other thousands of Indigenous youth who are also Ethan's age. Now, going back to university after this summer, after my summer internship, I decided to learn about my own community. And at this time, like most university students, is when I also started to travel. And one country quickly turned into 20. And some of my fondest memories were actually of working with Indigenous groups on many of the world's different continents. And what I realized through many of these travels was that, sadly, Indigenous people I found in other countries weren't really thought of as an integral part of that nation's history. Instead, I found more often than not they were sort of thought of as a development problem and kind of swept under the rug as something to be dealt with. But this sparked a curiosity in me to come back to Canada and then, learn about our own Canadian Indigenous community in a more focused but holistic way. And when I came back to Canada, I realized that the statistics and the research really married my childhood. You said I was grown up learning about residential school systems. In fact, I actually grew up just down the street from one. But I did not fully realize this profound legacy that years of abuse and over a century of attempted cultural assimilation had left on my people, and that many of the challenges that I faced growing up had actually stemmed from that. And so when I read some of this research, to me they weren't just numbers, I saw faces. When I read that 40% of Indigenous people live in poverty, I pictured the face of my neighbor waiting in line to cash his welfare check. When I heard that we can be up to 8 times more likely to commit suicide, I pictured the face of my family member that took her own life. Depending on where we live, we can be more likely to drop out of high school and finish it. Our unemployment rates are 3 times as high. We are disproportionately represented in our prison systems. We've all heard this story before. But through this, I realized that Canada really wasn't much better than the rest of the world in terms of our treatment of Indigenous people. And I had a really hard time reconciling this idea of how we think of ourselves as Canadians. We are a country so proud to wear that flag on our hearts. With the issues faced by more than 1 million people, men, women, and children in our own backyard, it's not something we like to talk about. In the fall of 2010, I took another leap of faith in my life, moving from northern Saskatchewan all the way across the country to Toronto, Ontario, to pursue an opportunity working in financial services. Now, being the small town girl in the big bad city, I did what most young single girls do, or at least what I thought they were supposed to do. And I signed up for Latin dancing classes. Yeah. Now, after one of my classes, one of my classmates and I, we went out for a bubble tea. Actually, even that was such a big city experience for me. And as we were chatting, he asked me where I was from, and through that it came up that I'm First Nations. So this guy, who was born and bred in Toronto, he was brave enough to tell me that I was the first Indigenous person that he'd ever met. And this, honest to goodness, surprised me because, I'm thinking in Canada today, we have 1.4 million people who are Indigenous. In Toronto, in fact, has the largest urban Aboriginal population in the country. And this was the first time in my life I'd ever heard anyone say that, keeping in mind I grew up in a primarily Indigenous community. But I ended up, telling him about my Dene heritage. I said, even when I say that word Aboriginal, it actually encompasses First Nations, Métis, Inuit people, with over 50 different linguistic groups, over 600 First Nations communities across Canada. I told him how, we're the fastest growing demographic in Canada, growing at roughly 4 times the rate of the non-Indigenous population. That more than half of us live in cities, and nearly half of us are under the age of 24. And I'm clearly very excited telling him all these things. And he kind of leans in across from me, and with this perplexed look on his face, he says, "Gabrielle, how come I haven't learned any of this before?" But that's when I realized, no matter how much work I do in the Indigenous community, it really wouldn't matter until we all started to talk about it. I'm here to tell you today there's never been a better time for us to have this conversation as a country than right now. Because as Canada's fastest growing demographic that skews very young, we have this population tsunami that's coming, and it's going to hit our country. In fact, in the next decade, we have enough Indigenous youth about to enter the workforce that they could fill up all the federal public sector jobs nearly 2 times over. So with 400,000 Indigenous youth set to become your customers, your workforce, your neighbors, it's my belief that we need to start having the conversations and making these decisions that will have a significant economic benefit for our Canadian whole. And like I said, the time has never been better for us to have this conversation than right now. And since this moment of realization, I've really made it my life's mission to be a catalyst for these conversations and plant these small seeds of change in the circles I've been so fortunate to sit in. I've sat on advisory boards, boards of directors. I've actually worked with heads of state. I've worked with national media, having these conversations, sparking these conversations. And as Zane mentioned, in 2011, I had this, what I thought was a very small idea, to start an Indigenous professional network. And since co-founding the Aboriginal Professional Association of Canada, I've been so fortunate to work with a number of amazing Indigenous leaders across this country. Indigenous leaders like Chief Clarence Louie of Osoyoos First Nation, leaders who are, Indigenous people who are lawyers for the UN, partners at the largest accounting firms. And through all of this, I'm starting to see how the tides are starting to shift in our community. And this is why I think it's a really exciting time to be an Indigenous person in our country. All we wanted to be was a supportive community and platform for these First Nations professionals, First Nations Métis and Inuit professionals. We host networking events, we do professional development, and we recognize the excellence that's in our community. Like I said, these amazing and resilient leaders. And through seeing holistically sort of what's going on in our Indigenous community in Canada, I start to have hope. Because as our education rates start to rise and our unemployment rate starts to decrease, this will have a significant effect on Canada's bottom line. In fact, the estimated cumulative benefit for increased Indigenous well-being is an estimated $500 billion, billion with a B, over the next 25 years. Let's just reflect on that number of zeros for a second. That's enough money to put every post-secondary student in Canada through post-secondary education for the next 13 years. That's 7 times our total trade relations with China last year. So clearly, we're missing out on this if we do nothing. There's a significant opportunity cost for us to do nothing. But the way I see it, none of this will advance. We can't reach for this opportunity as a country until we start talking about it. We have this amazing opportunity sitting in front of us on the table, but it's not going to start advancing until we talk about it around that table, whether at home, in your boardroom, at home when you're eating dinner with your families, or at work in our boardrooms. By the year 2026, the 400,000 Indigenous youth I mentioned will all be of working age. And why is this critical? Because this means that today, we are at this sweet spot of time where we have the opportunities to live by the values we hold so dear as Canadians and be a country, truly, where every child has an equal opportunity to succeed. The year 2026 is also special to me for another reason. That'll be the year Ethan turns 20 and is about to start his adult life. You guys, for me, that's my end game. I never want Ethan to face the things I faced growing up. I want him to feel loved. I want him to believe he can be anything he wants to be or do anything he wants to do. But just as importantly, wake up every single day and be proud of who he is as an Indigenous person. And my vision for Ethan's lifetime is something I believe is well within our reach, but it's up to you and I to have the tough conversations and the courage to ask questions about why this is the Canada we live in and how can we do better. I really believe we write our history as a country every single day through the choices we make, through the things we say, but just as importantly, through the things that we don't say. I want to leave you with a story that an elder once told me. On a sunny winter afternoon, this elder was walking through the bush in the snow with his son, who was about 4 years old, and he was teaching him about traditional medicines. Now, as they were, trudging through this deep snow, his son slowly started to follow behind him. And as they were walking, his son said, "Dad, it's a lot easier for me to step where you've stepped." Each day, every one of us is carving a path. In my life, I've really made it my life's mission to walk in a good way and leave meaningful footprints for Ethan and the hundreds of thousands of others Indigenous youth just like him across this country. But I can't do it alone. I encourage each and every one of you in your spheres of influence to quite simply, and this is just it, just start the conversation, because none of this will move forward until we all decide collectively that it's an important issue that we just need to talk about. So my call to action to you is just to talk about it, to ask questions. And why is this important? Well, because 10 years ago, a stranger made the choice to tell a young Indigenous girl that he believed in her. 6 years ago, I realized that the things I say and the things I don't say matter. And through all of this, through 100 other choices, 100 other footprints, which were not my own, I am standing in front of you today. Thank you.